Hello, everybody. Welcome to Joe the Lawyer. I'm your host, Joe Pometto, a practicing attorney here in Pittsburgh, PA. Now, the focus of my own law practice, as longtime viewers of the show and anybody who knows me from the Common Sense Academy knows, is criminal defense. I've been an attorney for about 10 years now, and I've been doing criminal defense for about 6 of those years. And when I was in law school, I worked for the Public Defender's Office, also the Office of Conflict Counsel. So my primary legal background is in criminal defense. And tomorrow and over the next couple of days, I'm going to do a breakdown of the Trump indictment itself. And what I want to do here is I want to use, I'm sort of going to use the Trump case, because it has everybody's attention, to teach everybody a little bit about the criminal justice system, because there are just so many misnomers out there. There are popular beliefs, popular opinions, popular myths, and things that we see on TV that are just roundly incorrect. And right now, everybody is going to be highly engaged in one of the most publicized criminal trials in the history of the United States, and I am going to use it to teach you. I want you to understand. My goal is not to present a political opinion. I'm not saying that won't happen, but I'm going to try to avoid it. My goal is not to skew you to one side or another. My goal is to teach you and hopefully give you the information to allow you to form your own opinion. Because once you have a greater understanding of the processes that are happening in the legal system, you will have a greater understanding of everything that's happening. And I promise you, you're not getting that full understanding from the mainstream media, no matter if you're watching the media on the left or the right. So I'm going to start today and with this article. I know it's from the BBC, and it's What is a Grand Jury? It's 5 days ago. It has a nice structure, but it's completely wrong about several things. So it's actually going to create a great opportunity for teaching. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, and share. Those are great free ways to support the channel, Joe the Lawyer, where I provide some legal education, I hope, and also some entertaining videos. Also, I have an email list. Feel free to subscribe to my email list to get updates on things that are happening with my law firm and also with my various YouTube channels. So down here, let's start over here. A grand jury has voted to let me start at the top. Former U.S. President Donald Trump is to be charged over hush money payments made to a porn star by his former lawyer Michael Cohen just before the 2016 presidential election. A grand jury has voted to indict him after investigating a $130,000 payout to Stormy Daniels in an attempt to buy her silence over an alleged affair. Mr. Cohen and 2 ex-aides are among those understood to have testified in front of a grand jury in New York. But how exactly does the system work? And here, the BBC says, what is the purpose of a grand jury? A grand jury is set up by a prosecutor to determine whether there is enough evidence to pursue a prosecution. And it says down here, in legal terms, it determines whether probable cause exists to believe a crime has been committed. In order to come to this conclusion, the jury is given investigative powers. It can issue subpoenas to compel people to testify or hand over documentation relating to the case. Members can also question witnesses who are not allowed to have lawyers in attendance. Now, all of that is true, but it only presents a little bit of the story. And perhaps I'll do an entire video on this. But one thing you have to start with is prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors who are elected officials in the United States, they have the power to choose when to file criminal charges and when not to. That is prosecutorial discretion. At its core, prosecutorial discretion is political. It's a political decision. Now, who has the power to prosecute, and who are prosecutors? Well, in the American justice system at the state level, let's break it down further. Generally, prosecutors are going to exist. You're going to have a prosecutor in every county in every state. So in Pennsylvania, for example, I practice out of Pittsburgh. I'm in Allegheny County. Allegheny County has an elected district attorney. That's the prosecutor. That is the individual who makes the decision on when to file criminal charges or not to. And you can sort of think of the police and law enforcement as an army of investigators who work for this district attorney to gather evidence and then come to the district attorney, this lawyer, this prosecutor, and say, these criminal charges need to be filed. It's actually the district attorney that makes the decision on whether to file or not. It's not the police, not law enforcement, although their decision in their decision making in that process is highly influential. So you have the county level. You have a county level prosecutor, which is generally referred to as a state's attorney or a district attorney. And that elected person makes the final call. And all the prosecutors, they can be called deputy or associate attorneys or state's attorneys. They all work for him or her. That elected official makes the final decision. That is your county/state prosecutors. Then you also have a statewide prosecutor who is called the Attorney General. The Attorney General is a statewide prosecutor, and they also have a little army of lawyers that works for them. And then there's sometimes state law enforcement. There's law enforcement, which is like their little army of investigators to find and prosecute criminal actions. So locally, you have a district attorney. Then statewide, you're going to have an attorney general. And then, of course, at the federal level, you have the United States attorney. And at the top of that food chain is the attorney general, who is currently Merrick Garland. So really, almost anywhere that you are in the United States, you're going to have three levels of legal enforcement. You're going to have your county prosecutors, a state attorney general, and a United States attorney general. And in this Trump case, this case that is being brought against him in New York, the United States, the federal government declined to prosecute. And then the local county district attorney, Alvin Bragg, picked up the case and decided to bring it forward. And I've seen in my own practice, you will have sometimes state officials don't want to pursue a case, and sometimes federal officials don't want to pursue a case. So the other ones will pick it up. Like sometimes the state won't want to pursue a case. So the FBI, who's like your federal police, right, will pick it up. And the U.S. attorney will prosecute the case, or vice versa, which is what happened here. That's not that uncommon, though. Usually a case will start out in the state, and then the federal will pick it up. Usually, it doesn't go the other way like it did here as often, but it certainly can, depending on the case. So this prosecutor, this individual, this person, okay, who's a county district attorney, a state elected official, has the power to make decisions. So Mr. Bragg had to look at the facts of this case, and he made a decision. Just like the U.S. attorneys made a decision not to prosecute, he made a decision to prosecute. Now, he called a grand jury to start this case, but he could have done it in a different way. He could have just filed charges and had it run through what's called a preliminary hearing. And I'll get to that in a second. So next in this article, it says, why is it in the legal system? It is in the Bill of Rights. The Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. So the or is in there. A presentment means a district attorney can just file charges. They don't have to run charges through a grand jury. Now, it certainly, again, grand juries exist on the state and federal level, but that's a prosecutorial choice or decision. So Mr. Bragg here decided to run this case through a grand jury instead of on quote-unquote presentment or just filing the charges and running them through the preliminary hearing, which I will talk about a little bit later. So it says here, who is on a grand jury? Members of the public. The U.S. Court's handbook says they are drawn at random from a list of registered voters, lists of actual voters, or other sources as necessary. Jury members may be called for duty for months at a time, but need only appear in court for a few days out of every month. That's pretty accurate. How many are on the jury? This can range from as low as 6 to as high as 23. Although a federal grand jury usually comprises 16 to 23 people, hence the term grand, because the trial or le petit jury is usually smaller. That's all accurate. How else does it differ from the trial jury? Unlike the trial jury, the grand jury does not determine whether a person is guilty of a crime. That's true. It also sits in secret. There is no media coverage. Generally, the person under investigation is not allowed to be present. The reasoning behind the secrecy is it protects the jurors from intimidation. It also protects innocent people from unfounded charges. Well, it protects innocent people from unfounded charges because the grand jury will not get the actions of the grand jury will not be publicized. Whereas, remember, let me back up. The Constitution says you have presentment and grand jury. Well, if a district attorney just files charges, it will automatically go to a hearing, which is public. Whereas through the grand jury, it won't be public. And if the grand jury decides not to proceed with charges, then everything that happened in it will basically remain secret and can die on a vine. So in that way, it can protect innocent people from unfounded charges, though I really don't love that as some of the reasoning here. Now, the reasoning behind is the secrecy. Yes, that's true, because if you do a presentment or an indictment's filed and it proceeds to a preliminary hearing, that is going to be public. And that means that the victims or the witnesses of the crime that the government is going to use to prosecute this individual will have to show up in court and publicly testify. So their identities and the content of their testimony will be public, whereas through a grand jury, it is kept secret, at least until the formal charges are filed. How does it decide to indict? Let's just real quick here, because this is a word that I don't know if people really always grasp. Formally or indict means formally accuse or charge someone with a serious crime. So let's just be aware of what the word indict is. And an indictment is just the document that formally accuses or charges someone with a serious crime. And it's usually, if and when we look at the Trump document, you'll see it's just a list of the alleged legal violations, the alleged legal criminal violations. So almost always, this is the language used in the criminal context. So how does it decide to indict? The jury does not have to be unanimous to recommend an indictment. The majority can vary. It can take 2/3 or 3/4 verdict. Federal, state, and county prosecutors all use grand juries, but all federal crimes must have a grand jury indictment. However, if the jury does not vote for indictment, charges can still be brought if prosecutors convince a judge. Grand jury processes can last months, even years. While all states have provisions to allow for grand juries, only around half use them. Pennsylvania does use them. While other states prefer to rely on a preliminary hearing to determine whether or not to indict a defendant on non-federal charges. Remember, these two different processes here. So if you have a preliminary hearing instead of the grand jury process, what happens is the government has to bring witnesses in and have them testify, and then a judge will decide if the case should move forward, if the formal charges should proceed. And then after the preliminary hearing, just like after a grand jury, once the decision is made, then the case will be set for a trial date, and it will go on to a trial track, which will take place at a later time. So this touched on a lot of the aspects for a grand jury, But let me talk about the real use of a grand jury. Why? Let's go back to the decision in prosecutorial discretion and say to ourselves, when a prosecutor is looking at a case, what makes them decide? You saw in federal court they have to use them, but in state court, what would make a prosecutor decide? They say, I will use a grand jury, or I will use the preliminary hearing process. Why would you use one over another? Now, this article here says, well, secrecy and protection. Yeah, those are part of the reasons for very highly sensitive cases. But there exists a more, I don't want to say, let's say more realpolitik reason. And that probably gives it away. It has to do with politics. If a district attorney just decides to file criminal charges against somebody, and then there's a preliminary hearing, but that initial decision is made by the prosecutor, and then it's made by a judge. It's made by the prosecutor, and then it's made by a judge. But when a case proceeds through a presentment or through the preliminary hearing, it's seen more as a decision made by the prosecutor herself. So, for instance, I was watching a video, Dr. Todd Grande, where this guy was throwing rocks over a cliff. And he threw a rock over a cliff, and it hit a mountain climber. It hit a rock climber and killed him. Now, he didn't see the rock climber until after he threw the rock. And so this prosecutor decided not to prosecute this guy who threw the rock for a crime because he thought it was an accident. The guy was extremely remorseful. He was a former military veteran. But that decision was all on that prosecutor. He decided not to prosecute him. And I don't believe the family of the victim agreed with that. With everything that's happened in the last 3, 4, 5 years, let's take, for instance, cases where the police or law enforcement shoot and kill somebody. Okay, and the question is, should these officers be put on trial for murder, for aggravated assault, for third-degree homicide, things like that? Those decisions are made. Oftentimes, the prosecutor will come forward, look at the facts, and say, I'm not proceeding forward. And that's a decision. He has the power to do that. But he also, and this is the reason why it's a political decision, he has to accept the political consequences of that decision that was made when he doesn't charge. Or if they do decide to charge, if they decide to charge a police officer, they are accepting the political consequences of charging a police officer with a crime. So that's prosecutorial discretion. And when you do it through a presentment or preliminary hearing, generally in the media and the public eye, that decision is going to be put on the prosecutor. So let's say a prosecutor wants to separate himself or put some distance between him and that very difficult and hairy decision. Lo and behold, the grand jury. The grand jury is a collection of citizens who will hear the evidence and then, quote unquote, make an impartial decision, right? Now the evidentiary burden at a preliminary hearing or a grand jury is very, very small. Every state might call it something different. Pennsylvania, it's called a prima facie case. It's literally 1%. It's 1%. It's this tiny bit of evidence that says, yes, a crime may have occurred. Really what a grand jury or a judge at a preliminary hearing is saying they're just saying there's enough here that it should go to a trial and that it should be heard by a jury or judge with a reasonable doubt burden of proof. That's all the decision is. They're not saying someone's guilty. Like, Donald Trump, whoever it is indicted. It doesn't mean you're guilty. It just means there's enough evidence that maybe a crime happened and a trial should be held. So if a prosecutor uses a grand jury, then what they're doing is they're insulating themselves and the prosecutor says, I didn't make the decision to prosecute, the grand jury did. I didn't make the decision not to prosecute, the grand jury did. And then he can look like he's doing his job, okay? But the people made the decision. The people, these citizens from the area who sat on the grand jury, they made the decision, not me. And that's what the prosecutor in the Donald Trump case did. He didn't just file these charges. He put it before a grand jury. He said, let the grand jury decide. And the grand jury decided to move forward with the charges. And in that way, a prosecutor can politically insulate themselves from charges on a particular case. And so it's a tool. It's actually a political tool. And while it is used in sensitive cases to protect identities and to protect the people involved in the case, it's more often the person that prosecutors make that decision. The reason they're making that decision is because they want to place some distance between themselves and those charges, or it's a really, really difficult decision. And so they put it to the people instead of putting it on them and filing a case through a presentment or through a preliminary hearing. So that's often the context, and I think that's really, really important here. You know, federal cases, they have to go through grand juries, so all of them will follow that process. But it's not true on state cases. And it's not true on all cases in the state of New York. In the state of New York, they can choose a grand jury or they can choose the presentment preliminary hearing. And that happens in Pennsylvania. And here's one of the problems, though, with the grand jury. At a grand jury, that person who's being indicted doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't have an opportunity to challenge those facts that are being presented. But at a preliminary hearing, they do. They will be there, and a lawyer will be there, and they can challenge those facts. And so when they talk about a little bit about grand juries, I don't want to say being fair or not fair. To me, a criminal defense attorney, I feel like they're a bit unfair. I don't like them because it doesn't give the person being charged an opportunity to challenge the case early on. It deprives them of certain rights that they would have if the case was not presented through a grand jury. So that's another advantage for the prosecution of a grand jury. And it's another political calculation that needs to be taken into account when a district attorney is deciding whether or not to bring charges. So, here's what I say, and we're gonna talk much more about this in the future. But voting for a district attorney in your local county is unbelievably important. And I would argue that the district attorney in your county is much more likely to impact your life in many ways, either directly or indirectly, than say like your local representative in the state legislature or your local representative in the county or city council. Okay, absolutely, those people have a lot of power. But a prosecutor has a huge say in shaping the character of the particular jurisdiction where he or she is. Tremendous amount of power, and that's my input on a grand jury. I did do this live. Brooke, thank you for jumping in, and Zeph, I am going to answer some questions here in the live chat, but I thought it was really important for people to know because as I talk to people, there's a lot of confusion about what a grand jury is. And a grand jury is not the jury that will decide guilt or innocence. that comes much, much later on in the process. Totally different, and there's reasons, there's calculations that go into it. So I want people to start thinking about that when they are viewing things in the news and hearing about how charges are brought against people. So the Ramseys were indicted by the grand jury for killing John Bonet, and the prosecutor didn't charge. And see, I don't know and I guess a prosecutor can still decide not to charge after a grand jury. Thank you, Brooke. I didn't know that. Well, actually, I did know that, because a prosecutor really, at any point in a case, a prosecutor can kill a case. And here in Pennsylvania, we call, they can withdraw, or it's called a null pros, like nullification of prosecution. So at any time, a prosecutor can kill a case, even if it got past a grand jury or a preliminary hearing. And it's almost like prosecutors are like these little gods when it comes to the criminal law. They decide which criminal laws are prosecuted and which ones are not. And the only thing that's really pushing them is public pressure and pressure from the police. They can completely ignore a criminal law if they want to, completely ignore it. And by fiat, they can make something legal when the legislature has said it should be illegal. Or they can take certain criminal laws and prosecute them to the 10th degree and make it almost extra illegal. So you really got to be aware of the power that elected prosecutors have. I'm telling you, it is tremendous. In that case of The Rock, the family would still have the right for wrongful death. Danny, that is a great point. Good evening, Danny. And that's exactly what that prosecutor said in that decision. The prosecutor said this should be handled in the civil courts. And the civil courts are different, right? The civil courts right wrongs in different ways, generally through money damages. There are other things like injunctions and certain types of orders that can be given by civil judges. But civil judges don't put people in jail. Civil violations don't deprive people of their liberty or their life, which the criminal laws do. So, yeah, that's what that prosecutor said in the case. The right said this should be handled civilly. And sometimes that's part of prosecutorial discretion. You're ignoring me, but the Ramseys were loaded. That jury's decision didn't matter. Hey, I'm not saying corruption doesn't play a role. It probably and absolutely does. But I'm talking, so, when an individual in power is making a decision, that's certainly something else that you have to think about, what their motivations are or were. But I want to give you a greater understanding of the processes that exist in the countries that are set up by the Constitution and by the laws of the states. Is the prosecutor only presenting to the grand jury? Yes, only the prosecutor presents. And that's one of the issues that I have with it, Zephiel, is that the defense doesn't get an opportunity to counter what's being said at a grand jury. The defense does not get, so they're only hearing one side of the story. And look, I understand it's not the trial itself where you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But even here's one thing, like once the machinery of the criminal justice system begins to move against an individual, it's an incredibly life-changing event. And, like Donald Trump aside, we're talking about regular people. When they get charged with crimes, they're going to be, number one, if they have children, okay, their children could be at risk. You could have CYS, you could have child use services involvement. Number two, their reputation and name is going to be badly damaged with their family and throughout the community. Number three, it can be, when you have pending criminal charges, it's publicly searchable. They could lose their job or have a hard time getting a job, getting into education, into academics, getting into schools. So once that machinery begins to move against, like targets an individual, it locks onto somebody. Even just facing a trial, even if you beat it, is a life-changing, harrowing, extremely stressful and difficult event. Not to mention the fact that for many people, you will be sitting in jail while you are awaiting the outcome of that case, and you may end up being found completely innocent, but you may have spent 9 months in jail before your trial came. Blasphemy, Joe. My goal is to be commissioner of the jury. Brooke, that is a really, really cool job, and I wish you the best of luck. And all the jury administrators that I've met in my county have been tremendous people who really care about their job, are really nice, professional, and fun. So I wish you the best of luck. They are the gatekeepers. Would you agree it's a major flaw of the legal system that criminal charges can only be brought by prosecutors? Well, what is the alternative? What's the alternative, Zephiel? That is the question. Now, I think in some countries, it's more of a judge, quote unquote, a judge. But maybe the decision shouldn't be in the hands of a single person. I mean, that's what a grand jury does. It dissipates the decision-making process. So there's good things about a grand jury, don't get me wrong. But here's the other thing too, though, is you do have multiple ways to challenge a case. Well, it's harder to challenge one that comes through a grand jury. So you can challenge cases that are presented through a preliminary hearing. But that's a good question. I don't know what the alternative is. I'm sure there are, like I said, it could be judges, it could be a counsel. The sovereign citizens would claim that it would be a common law jury. But I don't know what the alternative is. The DA in my county is the coroner. Sit with that for a few minutes. Now, does that person, coroners used to be the ones to bring certain charges, I think. I mean, every county is like a little different. That's more of an old style, Brooke. But I don't know exactly how all that works. Ground jury sounds idiotic. It's like the prosecutor's testing his one-sided case to see if it has any merit at the cost of jurors' time. Zephiel, that is exactly what is happening. So at least through a preliminary hearing, okay, a prosecutor makes a decision, but early on in the case, the defendant, the person charged, and their lawyer get an opportunity to challenge the witnesses in open court. They won't generally present evidence at that early stage, but you can challenge it and you can make arguments early on. And a lot of cases are thrown out after preliminary hearings. So cases will survive grand juries that would not have gotten past a preliminary hearing. And that is a big problem that I have with that system. So I really wanted to do this video. The Donald Trump case is just going to present opportunities to really talk about these issues in the criminal justice system that are detailed. I wanted to shift this channel to me doing basically 10 to 15 minute videos covering historical trials and giving my own analysis on them. I think I'm still going to do that, but I just really can't resist because this is just going to be such a huge trial. I think I have to talk about it. But he's also elected to keep low crime, no suspicious or violence, death here. Brooke, I thought in some counties the coroner would could only bring charges on cases where people died, like a coroner's inquest. So I don't know if they always overlap, but that's very interesting, and that is another method that exists in this country that I really don't know that much about, but it is interesting. Okay, that is my episode today, talking about what a grand jury is. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm Joe Pometto, Joe the lawyer. I'm going to use this Donald Trump indictment to talk about the legal system without speaking about it in a highly political way or inserting my own political opinions, just my opinions on the system and the process. Believe it or not, that is the stuff that I find more interesting than the politics of it. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Attorney Joe Pometto. This is Joe the Lawyer. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It's a free way to support the show. Also, sign up for my email list to get updates on the show and my law practice. Thank you, everybody. Love you guys. Hope to see everybody again